Okay, great. So welcome to today's Lunch and Learn webinar, The Grantee Perspective, the relationship between nonprofits and Jewish teen foundations. We have a great webinar today, and during today's webinar, Naomi Scott-Richter, who's the Program Associate here at the Jewish Teen Founders Network, will interview Leah Siskin. Leah is the Assistant Director of the Jewish Coalition Against Domestic Abuse. And Leah is the former Program Director for the Jewish Youth Philanthropy Initiative, which is part of the Partnership for Jewish Life and Learning in Rockville, Maryland, where she was for 6 years. So we're really excited about this interview, talking about both sides of the table. And I'm going to pass it over to Naomi and Leah to kick it off.
Great. So thanks, Andrew. During this interview, Leah will have the opportunity to share her perspective on the grant application process, wearing two hats, that of former Teen Foundation program leader and current Teen Foundation grant recipient. You can see more about her background on the screen now. So she'll answer some of my questions wearing one of those hats and some from the place of having both experiences. And we hope that you will contribute some questions also during the end of this call. So if you come up with any ideas for that, please do put them in the chat, and we'll give you the opportunity to be unmuted and ask them towards the end of the call. So to start off, knowing, Leah, that teen foundations usually award relatively small grants and that there's not always an opportunity for an ongoing relationship between a nonprofit and a teen foundation, since often the teen foundation's priorities can change from year to year, what do you think motivates nonprofits to apply for grants from teen foundations?
Great question. Hi, everybody. A little strange to not see faces, but we'll go from there. I think for the nonprofits, I know for our organization, we definitely see it as an investment in the future funders and also in their education and becoming well-educated funders who understand what it takes to run a nonprofit. So I definitely think there are a number of people in working for nonprofits who sort of see it as that investment, even maybe more so than what the actual grant amount is. And I think for others who maybe are less familiar with teen philanthropy or sort of the power of young people in general, it may also be the piece of often you're not applying as one organization among a vague number of organizations that you have no idea how many people are applying. I know when I was running JYPI, the organizations knew that there were 4 other organizations being considered for the particular pot of money, and those odds are a lot higher than many other sort of random pots, especially smaller ones, that they may not know whether it's worth investing their time or not. So I think it's a two-part piece for nonprofits.
So it sounds like part of that piece is some general education, just kind of for the greater good, not just for the nonprofit?
Yes. I think so. I know when I was at JYPI, we had teens who would get involved the following year with one of the organizations they met with in their first year, and they would do that on their own. And I would often tell organizations that were new to the JYPI process that part of the benefit is introducing and exposing your issue and your particular organization to this group of teens. And for a lot of organizations, that's also an added bonus because that's an additional source of possible volunteers, depending on what kind of programming, or what kind of issue they're taking on. If they can utilize school volunteers, that might be something down the road thinking about, because we've definitely had kids who find sort of the issue that they're passionate about and continue on with one of the particular organizations in the following years. And that's definitely something I shared with organizations to help them see some of the benefits if they didn't already. And I have to say, for probably 75% of the organizations when I was at JYPI, usually the development person or whoever it was I was in touch with very much got the education piece and saw it as sort of an investment in long-term philanthropy, in general. A few people you would kind of have to pose it to and do a little bit more framing and talk about some of these kinds of benefits that they could directly see.
Great. So that's definitely a piece that as program leaders we can kind of talk to nonprofits about. Terrific.
And I would just add that you can usually tell in a 2-minute conversation with someone what their interest is in terms of how they see their own organization. So I'd usually just listen and figure out whether it's the volunteers, the future philanthropy, or the direct grant themselves, because especially for some of these very tiny organizations, $2,000 would go a long way.
That's great advice. So many teen foundations are giving away relatively small dollars, let's say $1,000 total as kind of a lower end of the spectrum. And program leaders, especially of those programs that give more modest funds, often express concerns that they're asking too much of an organization for this amount of money. So from your hat as a grant applicant, how many either pages or how much time is appropriate to ask a potential grantee if you're kind of offering a fairly modest amount of money, such as $1,000?
Right. So for the smaller grants, I think about donors, who would write an individual donor who would write a $1,000 check, and what is the kind of information they may be looking for before they're going to write a $1,000 check. And I think for these pieces, you want to still give, who is the organization, what's their mission, is there a particular project? But I think it's sort of in the project description, because all of the work that they're doing, they have language for. So you want to sort of frame it, I guess, at the most basic level of things they probably already have. So you're talking about copying and pasting and spending maybe an hour pulling things together, but it's all stuff that they already have. So I think some of the what I call meatier questions, maybe about the sustainability of a project or the experience of the people running the programs. Some of those more in-depth questions, I think for $1,000 is probably a little bit much, but you can absolutely ask about, or you should absolutely ask, mission, what's the program, how is it going to be evaluated, when is it taking place, and then when it comes to budget, I think you could ask for $1,000. You don't need a budget. You could certainly ask just for the learning experience for them to provide their organizational budget, and that way you still get the experience of training the teams about how to look at a budget, but you haven't asked them to try to craft something about how they're going to spend $1,000 on a spreadsheet.
Great. Again, really good advice you have to share with us. So I'm going to move into 2 questions related to site visits. Remember, if you have any questions about the first kind of topic was the application process, please put them in the chat so we can ask them later. And so my next question for you, Leah, is what does a successful site visit look like? Can you speak about this from both the program leader's perspective and the nonprofit perspective?
Sure. So I think I'll start with the program leader perspective. So for teens, and I think the hardest part that I often heard from a lot of our facilitators were that, the first sort of questions to get started can be, you can be sitting there a while and the teens sort of just wait to see who's going to ask the first question, especially if it's their first site visit. And I think when it comes to preparing the teens, a lot of it goes back to the organization. So you can work with the teens to brainstorm lots of questions, and maybe even if it's a particularly quiet group or it's their very first time, sort of deciding who's going to ask what questions. but I also think there's a responsibility on the side of the nonprofits and on the teen philanthropy groups to set up the site visit in a way that is most likely to foster conversation and engagement. So I know with JYPI we had a presenter guideline one-pager that we sent to every organization we were coming to, and it basically laid out for them, you have an hour, here's how to set it up so that you do an introduction, and then always ask that they do some type of interactive component, and depending on the organization, it may be, so for JCADA, who I work with now, we run a whole teen prevention program around dating abuse. So when we presented to JYPI, I ran a short modified version of the workshop teens typically participate in who come into our program. So they very quickly got to see what kind of things we were doing, and it helped generate some of the questions about, okay, so this is dating abuse, but then how do you serve people who come forward, and sort of created the opportunity for questions rather than if they had just sat and listened to me for 30 minutes talk at them. And I also found that when I was at JYPI, it was really helpful to let the organizations know that we wanted to set them up for success, that our goal was for this to be a meaningful educational experience for the teens and a positive experience for the organizations. And I think that also helped the conversation be more open when I would talk to the organization ahead of time and try to help them think about, especially if they don't engage teens normally, okay, how can you give the group a taste of what you do? Especially JYPI only ran, we had our sessions on Sundays. So a lot of nonprofits are not running the regular programming on Sunday. So in a lot of situations there wasn't necessarily something to come observe. I had a food bank once that gave the students a challenge for their 20 minutes. They had to see how many of the bulk bags of rice they could turn into smaller bags for families to come pick up. And the kids did it, and they felt really good, and you could see them all excited about how many bags they did. And the presenter launched into the next part of his explanation about what they do and said, this was great. Just so you know, at tomorrow's pickup, these bags of rice will be gone in about 40 minutes. And you could see them get what the scope of need was at the organization. So that's often an example I give. Also to help the organizations understand that the teens are coming as potential funders. I think we run into a lot where the organizations hear the word teen and they think community service programs, service learning, and think about, oh well, we'll just have them come in and do volunteer projects for 2 hours. And so making sure that they're very clear about how they should be thinking of the teens, and that if you wouldn't have a funder just come in for 2 hours and volunteer with no explanation about what you do or a chance to ask questions, then you shouldn't do that with a teen philanthropy group either. So I think that's sort of setting the expectations and working with the organizations in partnership, I think is beneficial on both sides.
Great. So moving on to another question about site visits. So I know that, and I think you touched on this a little bit, but I know that JCADA is a nonprofit that provides educational programming, unlike some of the organizations that you work with, that you would work with as a Teen Foundation program leader. So if you are working with a nonprofit that does provide educational programming with teens, when you bring them to meet with the Teen Foundation for a site visit, how do you strike the balance between running the educational program and allowing for a more traditional site visit where they can ask questions about the nonprofit and the grant proposal?
That's a great question. So I know I can tell you what I did for JCADA's presentation last year, which is that we did a general sort of introduction, and then I did our It's Not Love workshop with them, but just the beginning of it. And so what I did was I looked at it and said, okay, here's the piece that'll A, fit in this time frame, and B, here's the appropriate place in the workshop where rather than moving into discussing the specifics of red flags of unhealthy relationships, I'm going to take it as a jumping off point to say, so these are some of the issues that we cover in this workshop. And JCATA runs these workshops for X amount of schools and is only part of our mission, and then launch into our mission. And in the case of JCATA's proposal last year, we actually were asking for funding related to our clinical therapy services. So I used the teen education piece as a way to engage the students, but then very mindfully chose where to make the segue into sort of that clinical direct service piece that we were actually looking at getting funding for. So I think it may also be helping the organizations think a little bit outside the box, because somebody else might have thought, oh, well, we're not asking for the teen education program, so why would I start by introducing a piece of the teen education program?
When I hear you talk about this, it sounds like you were pretty involved in working with the nonprofits when you were working at JYPI to help them craft this site visit experience. Is that true, and what did that look like?
So a couple years, probably 3 or 4 years ago, we found, so JYPI had a few different teen philanthropy groups. At one point I think we had up to 6. And so what we found was certain facilitators of the groups would spend a lot of time chasing organizations. And that was both time consuming, ineffective, and also very frustrating for the facilitators. So we started an LOI process, a letter of intent, but not quite as formal as some LOIs are that are a little bit longer. But we basically sent out to all the organizations we knew and all the organizations that teens had brought to us, and so basically everybody on our list, and said, our next grant cycle is coming up. We're looking to see what types of projects people are interested in. Can you send us 1 to 2 project ideas, just a paragraph each, and tell us what you'd be interested in getting funding for? And we had a great response to that, and that made it a little easier to sort of have a pre-screen of here's what's out there, here's what might be of interest, it also helps you see sort of who gets it. Sometimes organizations would submit for, let's say, curriculum, and I can say in 6 years I never ever saw teens fund curriculum. So that also sort of gave you an idea of where they were at. And I would often do the facilitators in JYPI created for the first level, our entry-level kids, without getting into all the sort of structure things, our entry-level first-year program, the facilitators actually selected the grant portfolio that the participants would look at based on certain requirements we had about how many Jewish organizations and local and so on and so forth. And our advanced program, the teens did all the nominating and selecting, but the facilitators would then do a call to the organizations to find out a little bit more about what they were interested in. So there were certain years where maybe I was co-facilitating, or a facilitator didn't have the time during the normal work hours, let's say if they were a teacher, to have this conversation with the organization, so then I would do it. And that was where these conversations about, okay, what are you thinking in terms of your interactive piece? Or often if the organization had a question and maybe, again, couldn't reach the facilitator during that time, I was sort of the bottom line number that they could call when they had a question in getting prepared, which is how the presenter guidelines came to be, and that sort of piece of how to help them prepare.
So it sounds like a facilitator was very involved in crafting the site visit through conversation, not just sending out guidelines.
Yes. yes, we ask that they have at least have a conversation with a representative from each organization when that was coming. And over the years, different facilitators had different styles. Most people did it over the phone because it was faster actually than going back and forth on email. And I think often yielded much more clear quality presentations. Sometimes I think in emails, you don't have that chance to do the immediate back and forth adjustment as you're hearing information.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah, I've heard from others in the field how important that contact is with the nonprofits to really ensure a good experience.
Yeah. And I think for the ones who have really positive experiences, they're also the ones most likely in whether you have a policy of you can't apply every year or maybe you don't have a policy like that, they're the ones who are likely to come back, and there is an investment as an education program in having organizations, see the program positively and be interested in participating in the process again.
For sure. So we've heard from some nonprofits over the years that teen foundations are not always great at wrapping up the grant process, especially when they've decided not to fund an organization. Can you give any advice about how teen foundations should handle nonprofits that they've decided not to fund, both from your experience at JYPI and also from the nonprofit perspective? What would you expect to receive in terms of follow-up?
So this is a great question that I don't think I truly appreciated until I started at Jakarta. But in terms of follow-up at JYPI, our process was always that once the grants were decided, the facilitators were responsible for putting out a communication to everyone in the grant pool. I mean individually in individual emails, but that everyone should receive some type of communication. Depending on the group, sometimes the facilitators actually had the students contact those who were being invited to come to the to the check presentations. And then for the emails about not getting funding, we had a template email that facilitators had access to, and if they preferred, they could just copy that and send it to the contact people at the organizations. I had certain facilitators who felt strongly it should be a phone call and would call, which I also think is great. The other piece of follow-up that as an organization is so helpful is understanding why it wasn't selected. And I think when I was at JYPI, especially at the beginning, I was worried or concerned about hurting the feelings of the organization, right? And especially because sometimes the students always had great logic on why they weren't funding, but especially for the groups where maybe it was just that they had 6 really strong proposals and there wasn't really anything wrong with the 6th organization, but it just wasn't as strong as the others. I was very concerned about how to tell the organization that. And now being on the flip side, I understand how helpful it is, even if the answer is just there were too many good organizations, because if there is something that wasn't coming across well, I don't want to submit the same proposal to another granting body and get the same feedback twice when I could have fixed it or could have updated it. So I would say when I was the program director, I had a fair number of organizations that would call afterwards and ask for specific feedback. And so I'd go to the facilitators of the group and ask, if there was anything particular they could suggest, give as feedback. And when I was facilitating our advanced program also for several of these years, and at that program I would have them on their pros cons list sort of write out kind of what were some of the things at the end that they would like the organization to know if their grant wasn't selected. And I think it was very helpful for the organizations. So while follow-up is sort of that extra time-consuming piece, especially when your goal may be more education than grants management, again, to sort of invest in that relationship, especially I'd say in a community, in any community where if you're looking for a certain number of Jewish organizations, by default there's always going to be more non-Jewish organizations than Jewish. You really want to spend the time and have a positive experience with the nonprofits, and I think that follow-up piece, even if it's just a day, and I did not call all the organizations once they've been notified. I didn't necessarily proactively call everybody to say, here's your feedback, but I did respond to anybody who asked specifically for feedback after they'd been notified that they weren't being selected for this year. And we also always made a point to let the organizations know that even those who were not selected would be listed in the information that the families received at their closing check presentation, so that if a teen was interested in the organization, even if they weren't funded, they would still have access to that information, which I think was a good sort of goodwill gesture also that didn't take any additional time for us.
That's a great gesture. I also really like that you suggest that teens could provide the feedback that they would want the organizations to get, so you have that on hand, because I think part of that is just providing the education to the teens that it would be appropriate, especially if this were for much larger dollars, to give feedback to an organization.
Mm-hmm.
Did you ever, I'm sorry if I missed this, did you ever have the teens directly involved in giving, in like writing a letter, a grant denial letter, or did that come from staff?
The grant denial letter was something that was created by the staff. That was just part of the packet of materials electronically that our facilitators had access to. So it would have been an interesting experience for the teens, because we do have them make follow-up phone calls to the organizations when they've sent out the request for grant applications. This was for the advanced program, and I think that was a really positive experience for them. And in both our first-year program and the advanced program, if teens wanted to call or notify an organization and invite them, they were encouraged to do so and given the details and language, but we never had them do the opposite of calling the ones who weren't getting the funding. So that would have been an interesting learning opportunity for them.
Certainly, maybe for a more advanced group, kids who
had
a prior year. Great. So as a program leader, what was most challenging about working with potential grantee organizations?
I think the genuine interest, yes, but then the lack of follow-through, I think was definitely a challenge. And as I mentioned earlier, sort of where our LOI process came from, because we definitely had the experience with certain nonprofits where they would say yes, but then either the person who became our point person would sort of go MIA or would stop responding, and not that we were in touch, all the time between when they applied to when they were presenting, but checking in and making sure they were ready, and or even getting the grant turned in after we had, let's say, a great conversation with someone at the organization and they're clearly enthusiastic, and then all of a sudden they're not there anymore, or they're not responding, or there was a staffing change. I think some of that piece, or as the case was a couple times, especially during the recession, we definitely had it happen where an organization, we'd be trying to track them down, and then they finally get back to us and say, I'm really sorry, one of our larger foundations or funders now needs something during the same time frame, and we don't have the capacity to do both things. Sorry. So I think that sort of unexpected piece could be really challenging. Also the fact that the person talking to you on the phone, between 9 and 5, Monday through Friday, and then the person, again, our site visits were all on Sundays, the person showing up on Sunday was not necessarily the person either they told you was showing up or they hadn't transferred the information. So suddenly this person doesn't realize it's a group of teens or is not the most interactive, engaging speaker. I think some of that is definitely a challenge, although when there was when that pre-call did happen, and especially after we created the presenter guidelines, I saw the number of times that was happening go down, although you can't control everything, and it definitely still occurred, as the unpredictable nature of nonprofits can be. So I think that was kind of one of the challenges and opportunities to really learn how to sort of go with the flow and think on your feet, which is why I think people with things like camp counseling backgrounds as facilitators are really great, because they're very good at sort of going with whatever they're handed and making it work.
Well, I was going to ask how you address these challenges, but it sounds like you had some success when by having that very early on, having a conversation about site visits, address the issue of like the person who was not prepared, not appropriate, showing up there on Sunday somewhat. Mm-hmm. Was there anything else you wanted to add on that?
So I think the other piece is that sometimes, and I think one of the great things about teen philanthropy is you have this very authentic, real-time experience happening with the teens, and sometimes nonprofits screw up, just like everybody else. And so there's also that moment of when it's something to sort of seize as a teachable moment. We had an organization several years ago who did sort of this, it was one person on the phone and a different person on the day of, and the day of person just never showed up. And the organization sort of first said, oh, they were there, but they were on the other side of the building, and our group of teens, and I happened to actually be at that presentation, we were like, no, there was no one anywhere in sight, the building was locked, and went back and forth with this organization. And rather than them just sort of saying, this was a horrible mistake and let's figure out how to rectify it, it escalated up to their board chair, who was the person who eventually said, I am so sorry, this should not have happened. What can we do to fix it? And we brought it to the teens and said, here's what happened. Here's all the communication. It's your grant pool. What do you want to do with this? And they had a very meaningful conversation about what do you do when when the grantee doesn't hold up their end of the bargain and the responsibilities, and you haven't even given them money yet. And while it was an organization that a number of the students were very interested in, and ultimately they felt like this organization should apply at maybe in the following year or at some point in the future, but that because it had gone on as long as it had and wasn't an immediate fix and they weren't immediately taking responsibility, somebody had pointed out, what happens if something else goes wrong? Is that the way they handle all their problems? So they ended up deciding as a foundation that they were not going to consider the grant, and they took it out of the mix.
That is a really important story, and I think the takeaway from that is that you can always use what happens in real time as the teachable moment or teachable situation. So
absolutely,
that's terrific. The other challenge that you brought up was this issue of an organization kind of expressing interest and then not really having the follow through. Is there anything you can advise about addressing that? Did the LOI process help with that?
The LOI process definitely helped, and was an idea of someone on our board who was, basically pointed out that, he, as being on another foundation, he would never, chase organizations, so that we needed to sort of take it up a notch. And so the LOI definitely helped because it gave us a much clearer picture of sort of who was interested, and often the people, again, it was only, if you were going to submit 2 project ideas, it's 2 paragraphs. So it wasn't particularly time intensive, but we found that the people willing to put 2 paragraphs to paper did follow through on the bigger pieces. I think the other part of it too that got JYPI's grant portfolio was depending on the group, was about 2/3 Jewish organizations and 1/3 local, and it didn't have to be Jewish necessarily. And so of course there were many, many, many more non-Jewish organizations that were interested, and we had anywhere from 2 to 4 slots for Jewish organizations. And so because we had multiple teen philanthropy groups and we wanted to make sure everybody had different Jewish organizations, that's where it was more likely we were going to have the chasing issue of trying to find organizations. So I think there it also became us reaching out to the community, reaching out using tools like Slingshot, looking at the Natan Fund, looking at other funders who fund Jewish organizations to see are there organizations locally or in our case we also look at Jewish international organizations. Are there organizations we haven't heard of and we don't know, and that might be interesting to the teens. And also we asked our teen leadership board every year to both look at the LOIs as well as share with us any nonprofits that they knew about. So I think also continually kind of doing a scan to make sure of whatever the communities are that you'll accept proposals from, to sort of help keep fresh blood in the mix, so that if you have organizations that have continually not met expectations, that you don't have to go back to them just because you need to fill a slot.
Right. It sounds like casting a much wider net than you actually need is the real message here.
Mhm.
Great. So I want to give everybody on the call the opportunity to ask your questions. So you have 2 options for doing that. You can type them into the chat and we'll see them, or you can press star, I believe it is 6, checking. Star 7. Star 7 to unmute yourself. Star 6 mutes yourself. We'll type that into the chat so you know. And then you can ask your question. And actually, I do see some coming in. So Celeste, if you could press star 7 to unmute yourself, you can ask your question by yourself.
Hi, Leah. I was very intrigued by the interactive component of a site visit, something that we never thought of, but I think could add a lot of merit to the whole experience. And I know you gave some really great examples of interactive components, but I was wondering if you could give a few more, because this is something that I might be interested in implementing for our foundation.
Sure. So another example we had was with a lot of the organizations who have certain populations they work with, we do encourage, right, so if they work with kids or they work with seniors, we do encourage them, even if they're not running a program on that day, to see who can come in to talk to the group. And sometimes interactive can just be as simple as maybe bringing in 2 or 3 people and splitting the group into smaller subgroups to do a little Q&A one-on-one and really feel like they've met one of the program participants. If they only bring one, then it can stay group Q&A, but make it more of a conversation than just the person coming in and sort of telling their story. And there definitely is a powerful component to telling their story, but to give that opportunity for more of a conversation. One of the aging organizations in this area did a great one year where they came in and they actually had the kids put corn kernels in their shoes and gave at least one person in each little pair glasses with Vaseline on them, and asked them to and they gave them oven mitts and asked them to complete tasks, very simple tasks that we all do, to help them understand why what some of the challenges are for the senior population that this organization served. And that was another sort of great out-of-the-box thinking on the organization's part of how do we showcase what we're doing and the struggles our population is facing. So those were a couple of the other ways. I'm trying to think if there's any other that come to mind off the top of my head.
Those are great examples.
Thanks. And I think
did you ever have pushback
from the organizations?
Yeah.
Not really. Occasionally there were organizations who maybe they said, okay, yes, interactive, and then they come in with like a PowerPoint. But that's a little bit also to their own detriment, and that's kind of what I tried very hard. And I would give them several of the examples of what people have done and try to think of, for whatever their issue was, how it would work. And we went to we're very close to the National Institutes of Health, and they have a children's inn where families stay while kids are getting treated. And in that case, we didn't do anything with the families, but we went into the actual children's inn. We did a tour, and then she had everything in the living room. And while I don't think for most things tours are really powerful enough, in this case, because they framed it as, imagine you're here for 6 months and this is your living room and here are the activities we're doing and how we're making it a family. And it really helped. I mean, the teens saw the kitchen and talking about what do you need to have a house and feel comfortable. So some of it also depends on the organization and their physical setting maybe, and how a tour could help. But I think a great question to ask organizations sometimes when trying to feel out this interactive piece is, what are some typical projects interns do, that volunteers do? Is there something we could do for 15 minutes that would give them the snapshot of what a typical day for a volunteer would be, or what a typical experience would be for someone who's benefiting from your services? So it's either like what's the typical, or how do you help them understand the problem? We also had somebody from Adults with Special Needs. They had a worksheet that they asked the students to complete, and it looked like a very simple worksheet, but it had this whole added level of instructions about flipping the multiplication sign to divide or something like that, to help the students understand how many more steps somebody with some type of developmental disability would have to go through to get an answer like 2 times 4 is 8. So that was another one that worked really well.
And how long was the site? How long were the site visits?
It's 1 hour.
1 hour. Okay. And
the interactive piece is usually 15 to 25 minutes, depending. And again, some places do a better job of we broke it out like 5-10 minute introduction, 15-minute what is this grant about, what's your mission, and some organizations did a better job at sort of seamlessly integrating that into the interactive piece, so that really they made that whole 35 minutes interactive and included the important information about the grants, and then the only thing left was the Q&A.
I think we have another question about some other technical pieces from your experience at State. Michal Greendown, can you press *7 to unmute yourself? Michal?
I have a quick question about how many sessions did you devote to the site visits, and in general, how often your group met?
Great question. So as I mentioned, we had a couple different models, so I'll just give the quick versions without going into the whole structure. But our first level program met over the course of a semester. It was originally designed as a year-long program, and they met once a month. But what we found was that the students, one semester to the next semester, their schedules would change, and it would complicate whether or not they could always make sessions. So we changed it and condensed it into a 6 or 7 session semester program. So then it just depended on the semester in terms of how often they met. But it was on average every 2 to 3 weeks. And then in our advanced program, it was year-long. It was 9 sessions, so it averaged once every 4 or 5 weeks, depending on the time of year. In the fall, they had, I think, 3 or 4 sessions, and then they condensed the second half with the site visits. And in the case of the first level program, they had an introductory team building session, and then they would do 4 site visit sessions, and then have their funding session, and then the closing. And yeah.
So you brought up the closing. I'm going to ask you to switch hats for a minute. And from the grantee perspective, could you speak at all about what you'd like to see in a grant ceremony if you were invited as a grantee to receive your grant at a grant ceremony?
Sure. So I think as a grantee, you come in, you've made this presentation. It must have gone well because they're now going to give you a grant, which is exciting. But I think getting a little bit better understanding of maybe who the organization is, what else the kids did. And then other than that, it's just a great experience to get to see kind of what they've done, the scope of it. I do really, at JYPI when we did the closings, the students each introduced the nonprofit, said a little bit about what the money was going to be for and why they chose the organization, which I think is always a nice thing to sort of hear what stood out to them. And we usually gave just a couple minutes for each organization to just get up and say thank you or say what else the money was going to. And I have to say, as an organization, I'm much more, if there's an opportunity to talk to people individually, either at the beginning of the program, sort of that schmooze time, really how the teens introduce us during the actual closing ceremony, that's more than enough. And then we say, our thank you, and can talk to anyone who's interested in our specific work individually during the schmoozing before or after. So I have to say, as an organization, I don't have a certain requirement that means this is going to be meaningful. I sort of, or I guess I do, but I find that the teen programs, at least from what I've experienced in JYPI and what I've heard from a couple other programs, definitely gets to that piece. You get to hear from the teens on sort of what they think and why it's important, and you get a chance to showcase your organization, but not in I'm standing up for 20 minutes talking about Jakarta or whoever.
Great. So again, I want to open the floor for any other questions. We have time for probably one more. If you have a question, you can press *7, or you could type it into the chat. Anything else burning?
I do have to say on the closing question, if anyone else comes up with a question, one thing that is really helpful is knowing that the families have the information about the organization, because I have seen over the years families give additional donations to some of the organizations, get involved on a volunteer level, and it's something that we always tried very hard to make sure we gave out a full grant portfolio with the websites of the organizations the students looked at, so that way they could continue to get involved with a particular organization that was their passion that they may have discovered through this, because that was always, for me, one of the successes of JYPI, that some kids were going to stay in philanthropy and that was their thing, but for a lot of them, finding the cause that spoke to them was also a success. So I think from an organization perspective, it's great to see that they have the information in front of them on how to get in touch with the organization, and maybe even directly with the person who represented the organization.
And I agree that that's also a really nice thing for the organization. It's very low barrier to just provide that at the end of the program, going home to all these parents and teens. So I have one last question. It sounded to me when you were talking about your experience with JYPI that you would go to the nonprofit for a site visit. I know that some teen foundations have the nonprofits come to meet with them. Can you speak at all to why you did it that way and what you gained from having the teens at the site?
So we actually did it both ways. If the site was going to add something to the experience, we went on a site visit. And for our first level program, we required that they had at least two out of their 4 organizations be a site visit. But we also looked at a Jewish international organization, and obviously we were not going to hop a plane to Israel or Argentina or a place like that, which would have been nice. So that right there automatically meant we were doing a non-site visit. And then we also wanted to account for organizations like Jakarta, where we have an undisclosed location for the safety of our clients and can't accommodate a site visit. So to not discount those organizations who either for safety concerns or just because they're in an office building and either it's not open on Sundays or it's not going to add anything to the experience. But I do think when you're looking at places, maybe they're doing direct service. We have a farm here that's run by adults with special needs. Going out to the sites and physically seeing the space. We have like I mentioned, we went to Children's Inn, and that tour absolutely made a huge difference in helping the teens understand what the issue and why the physical space is so important. So I think the site visit, and the teens would definitely tell you that the site visits were the best part, even if they ended up giving, let's say, their largest grant to one of their non-site visits. I think just that experience of getting out and seeing things happening where they actually are happening in the same way that adults, I think everyone gets something out of going to a place. I think it's why volunteering often feels so rewarding to people, because you see things taking place around you. So I think if you have the ability to work it in and go do a site visit or two, I think it's really important. I will say that if you're doing some site visits and some non-site visits, it's super important to keep to the time deadline, just because you're in a physical space or going to visit a particular organization. Don't let them sort of take advantage of that and say, oh, well, you guys are coming for an hour and a half, and I see the last half hour you're just going to be in a room meeting as a group, but are you sure you don't want to do X, Y, and Z for an extra half hour? Because that's an unfair advantage that the non-site visits don't have. So you want to still try to keep the playing field as equal as possible.
Thank you. Well, Leah, it's just been a pleasure to talk with you for this hour. If anyone has any follow-up questions, you can email them to us, and we'll get them to Leah and start a discussion about them if it's relevant. And now I'm going to let Andrew close this up.
Great. Thanks for everybody who joined today. Again, a big special thank you to Leah for sharing both her unique and informative perspectives. If you love Lunch and Learns, which I know some people on this call really do, then we hope that you can actually join us in person for our Jewish Teen Philanthropy Summit, June 9th and 10th in New York City. I know that several people on this call are already registered, which is great. This is our first national gathering of teen philanthropy programs since 2009, so we're really excited for this upcoming opportunity this summer. I want to note that signing up by this Friday, April 11th, will get you in at the early bird rate of $160. Before that, the 2-day summit price goes up to $225, so be sure to register by this Friday. We also have a 1-day program available on Tuesday for institutions and professionals that are not currently doing teen philanthropy that would like to learn more. Information about all this is on our website at jtfn.org, as well as a full list of our speakers and presenters. You can see a great list of people who will be there helping to lead this summit, including New York Times columnist Ron Lieber, Annie Hernandez from Youth Philanthropy Connect, David Breifman, Felicia Herman from Natan, Andres Piconi from the Jewish Funders Network. So we have a great group coming, and we hope that you can join us there. If you are coming from out of town, travel subsidies are also available. All of this information can be found on jtfn.org/summit. So we really hope to see everyone there in June if you're not already signed up. And with that, we're going to call it a webinar. So thanks everyone. You will be receiving slides.
The conference has been unmuted.
You will be receiving slides from this webinar in your email tomorrow. So thanks everybody.
And everyone's unmuted so we can all say our goodbyes and thank yous together. Thank you.
Thanks,
Leah.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.